Hello artists, it's Miss Munger here. Today I'd like to show you how to use your watercolor techniques practice sheet. And before I get started, I'd just like to give you all a reminder that this is just regular computer paper. It's not watercolor paper. So normally we would be using watercolor paper when we use watercolor paint. But for today, since this is just practice, we are just using a regular sheet of paper. But try to avoid getting your paper too wet. Because it will not be able to absorb very much water and it will just end up tearing. So try to not get your paper too wet when you are doing this. So every square on your paper has a different technique for you to try, and I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go through each square and show you the technique. So the first square is dry brush. So you can go ahead and pick a color in your watercolor palette. I'm just gonna use purple. I'm gonna get that color wet because it's dry right now. And then I'm gonna rinse off my brush and I'm gonna dry my brush on some paper towel right here. So, cause this is dry brush, I don't want my brush to be saturated with water. Instead, I'm gonna take my brush now that it's dry, I'm gonna dip it into the wet paint, and then I'm gonna explore making marks on the paper with a brush that is dry. Okay, the next square is wet on wet. This means that you go ahead and you wet the paper with water without any paint on your brush, and then you go ahead and dip your brush in some paint and explore what that looks like when you add the paint onto paper that's already wet. The next square is blending two colors. Okay, and then the next square is value, and I'm suggesting that you go ahead and try going dark to light. So for your dark, you'd like to make sure your watercolor is really nice and saturated with water here in your palette. Make sure you are loading your brush with a lot of that color, and then put that onto your paper for your dark, and then begin adding water to that color and making it lighter with the water. So the water is diluting the color and making it lighter. There we go. For the next square, you are going to do a wax resist, and that means you're going to color with crayon, make some marks with some crayon, and then go ahead and watercolor over the top of it. For the next square, you're going to explore putting down some marks in pen and different kinds of marker if you have them. So there's some Crayola marker, and there's some permanent marker of a Sharpie marker. Okay, now I have a square that says salt. So this is using a thick kind of salt called kosher salt. And I will come around and give you some salt. So you're gonna have a little bit of salt already at your desk. So I'm just gonna put mine right here, my watercolor palette, just a little bit right there so I can have it. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lay down some paint, some watercolor paint in this square. And while this square is still wet with paint, make sure it's nice and wet. Again, you don't need to put tons of water on this paper, but for the salt, it's important that you have enough paint and water down. And then go ahead and sprinkle some of the salt onto your painted square. And you're gonna let this dry completely. And then once it's totally dry, tomorrow you can take off any salt and you'll see the effect that the salt has on the watercolor. So if you got some of the salt over on other parts of your paper, just go ahead and wipe it towards the square with the salt so then you can see what that looks like. So I'm gonna leave that one alone and let it dry. For the next square, I'm going to wet my square again with watercolor. And then again, while it's wet, I'm gonna take my paper towel here and I'm gonna blot my paint and see what that does. Okay, and then the last square is your choice. So you could go ahead and play around with some different colors, so a little bit of color mixing, see what happens. Remember that to always go back to your water in between switching colors to try to keep your watercolor palette nice and clean. And you might have noticed that I used the same color for my different techniques. I just did that for simplicity, but you could go ahead and use as many colors as you would like. So there you go. You're going to carefully place this on the drying rack. And then tomorrow you can see what it all looks like when it's dry. It'll probably look a little bit different once it dries tomorrow. Happy art making. Thanks for watching.